Hi folks, Jennifer Nelson here, founder of Scout Real Estate. Glad you're listening in. I created Pocket Hours podcast to elevate our game and help us all learn from the best. I have interviewed some of the top producers in our industry about best practices, among many other things. We also tackle industry issues and changes with great conversation from many of our leaders. And the best part is you get clock hours just for listening in. After you have listened to 3 episodes, just email info@scoutrealestate.com to answer a few easy questions for the interview, and you will receive your certificate. Meanwhile, enjoy listening and learning, and go out there and be the agent you would hire. Hello, brokers of Washington. This is Jennifer Nelson with Pocket Hours, and today I got the privilege of talking to Dylan Chalk. Dylan has been a home inspector for over 20 years. He wrote a book called The Confident House Hunter, so check that out. And his home inspection company is called Orca Home Services. Orca as in whale, home services. Dylan and I had a great conversation today about what's important, broker, for you to know about home inspections, even if you sort of think you've got it all in the bag. This is a chance for you to hear from somebody who's been around the block many times and really gives great perspective on why a home inspection is so important. And pre-inspecting specifically, why he really, really recommends, along with me, we're on the same page there, to get your listings home inspected. So great nuggets in here. Really looking forward to you listening to what Dylan has to say. I am excited this morning to be able to talk to Dylan Chalk. Dylan Chalk is a residential home inspector who, we're going to get to this in just a minute, who wrote a book that we're going to talk about as well. But we want to talk to you brokers today about what's important about inspections and maybe crash the myth that you already know it all. And that you don't need to learn anything else, because they are such an integral and important piece of our job. And that's why I have Dylan on the show today. So Dylan, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So tell us a little bit, Dylan. You haven't been doing inspecting since you graduated from high school. That's my guess, or college. So what did you do prior to doing this gig?
Yeah, so lots of things really, but construction and house building was always sort of one of the things that I was doing. Is how I paid my way through college.
Okay.
And I had a small contracting company out of college, and then I've worked for different builders over the years. I sort of quietly always wanted to be a writer. That was this thing I wanted to do in my life. And then one realizes that a life of abject poverty is not in one's self-interest.
I love
Uh,
it.
So, you sort of figure out. So I actually, when I got into inspection, I was like, wow, this is really cool. Like I get to write reports, which probably
Okay.
makes me an anomaly as of a home inspector. I think most inspectors find the
Don't let you.
report, the obstacle between them and their paycheck. But
Yep.
I always thought it was really cool that I get to write every day and help people and communicate with, technical findings to people. And that is kind of what led to my book. I've always believed that the best way to communicate technical stuff to people that don't have a technical knowledge is with stories. And so I kind of, as I got into inspection, I was like trying to create stories for all these things that illustrate in a way that people will actually remember and understand. And so
Hmm.
then naturally one day you're like, oh, there's a book and all this stuff. It's all just a bunch of stories.
Yeah, for sure. And we're
Yeah.
going to get to your book in just a minute. So how long have you been doing home inspections?
I started around 2003.
Okay.
I think I did my
Yeah.
training in 2002, so about 20 years.
20 years. Oh, man. You've seen a lot then, I bet. That's pretty cool.
I was thinking about this, and I'm sure you have this. It's incredible how the business has changed in 20 years. I
Yeah.
mean, so for starters, report writing. I mean, we didn't even hardly have digital cameras 20
Right.
years ago, and the software was terrible. And so I ended up starting my own software company because I didn't like the reports that I could do with conventional tools, or the tools that were being sold to me. So that's changed a lot. And then, I mean, I probably spent the market changed in July of this year, but for probably about 5 years, all I did was work for sellers.
Mm.
The only buyers I would work for the last 5 years were new construction or
Okay.
some sort of off market deal,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So pre listings became like almost all of my business. And now it seems like it's a bit of a blend, you know. But that's kind of an amazing change that, I mean, 20 years ago, you only worked for buyers, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Let's
So,
talk about that trend for a minute because that seems like an important shift that a lot of listing agents are choosing with their sellers to go ahead and inspect the house prior to even putting it on the market. And what do you think the advantages are of that, in your opinion?
well, I mean, I think the main thing that has never made sense to me is that two groups of people would come to an agreement on a price and then do a bunch of research to figure out what it's worth. Or, I mean, it just seems backwards. So I think it helps come up with a more accurate price once you factor the condition of the building in.
Yep.
And price has a way of sort of compensating for all kinds of things. I mean, a house could need a new roof and a new deck and a new furnace, and who cares? You just build it into the price, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm, hmm.
so I think it's a much more logical way to kind of hit the market. And then there's the advantages of not coming on the market and then coming back off once an inspection happens.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
And I've always sort of defined the job of a home inspector as sort of helping people get their expectations in alignment with the building that they're purchasing. And I just think by doing that out front, there's much more likely to get those expectations in alignment, you know?
Yep. For sure.
Um, and I would be a
Yep.
big fan of a good inspection before and a good inspection, I mean, for the seller and for the buyer. I mean,
Hmm.
I think there's really value in both of those things.
Yeah, for sure.
There's certainly some risk in the pre-listings. I see some that aren't really worth anything, and that I think is terrible marketing for the profession of home inspection. I mean, you read them. I've had people come to me like, "Hey, will you go over this report and, help my son is buying this house?" And sure, send it to me. And then you read it and you realize like, well, you have to proceed as though an inspection were not done here. I mean, that there's not enough information to make me in any way confident that
Right.
anything was looked at.
For sure.
So I don't know. I think it's not a panacea. To me, it has to be done well. And I actually teach a lot of home inspection classes, but doing pre-listings really changed how I write a report. In the old days, if you worked for a buyer, a report could be a sort of punch list of like the big things we talked about on site, and the agent could use it to like negotiate.
Yep.
Whereas if I'm doing a pre-listing, I haven't met any of the people that want value from this thing. They have no idea what I did, whether I was thorough or not, and what I was looking at. And so I build a lot of my inspection procedures into my reports now because I have the technology. You can it's really easy to put a lot of information and kind of couch it well so that you can distinguish background information from sort of repair type items. And I bet that's changed a lot of people's report writing because I'm not the only inspector that moved to doing a lot of pre-listing inspections.
Yeah, and as a listing agent, there's a variety of reasons why I think pre-listing inspections are really important. And one of the ones we didn't touch on, but sort of you touched on, is that we come to a price based on market, and we're talking to our clients about that price, but we don't really know if there's big ticket items that need to be fixed in the house that could come up later for negotiation. So to your point of
Hmm.
value, this is sort of saying, okay, this is what the market bears for your house, at least on paper. Now let's go ahead and get our hands dirty and figure out what else is going to impact that price and either fix it ahead of time or alter our price to make it a compensation for what needs to be done to this house. And so I'm a huge pre-listing fan. I think it's very odd to go on market sort of crossing your fingers and hoping that the inspection goes well. I mean, you might as well go find out for yourself and sort of head that off. I also find that buyers will negotiate a lot more money for any particular item on an inspection if they do it later than you could then head it off before they even start
Yeah,
negotiating on those things. So yeah.
that's right. I mean, if you find there's certain items that we find as inspectors that carry risk, and you would need some time to identify what that risk is. And once you're on the market, the clock is ticking on these inspections, and people will be like, well, I don't know what that's going to cost, so I'm going to ask for $50,000 or whatever. and
Right.
and it might cost 10,000, but you didn't have the time to get the people out and do the research and figure it out. So
Yeah.
I love the fact that those take place without the same time constraints as when
Yeah,
you work for a buyer, and
for sure.
creates a lot more ability to get good information. One of your questions was sort of what should real estate agents know about home inspection, and there's so much you can't know when you show up for 3 hours, and I mean, back in the day when there was a lot of verbal consultations, and I would get a lot of questions of, hey, we just want you out for an hour and all we want to know is the big stuff. It's not as though a home inspector has some sort of special glasses that just point out the big things. Like, you have to look, I
Right,
mean,
right,
and it
right.
takes time. And I can't tell you how many, over 20 years, there's been a lot of times I've found really important big things that I barely found. And it took a lot of looking and even thinking. And I mean, there's times you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, oh, I understand what's happening there. There's a very limited amount of time we really have to look at a building when we're doing an inspection. And yeah, just takes time to kind of synthesize all that
Yeah,
stuff.
for sure. And to your point, Dylan, I think it's a great one to say. And I've been practicing for 20 years, like you, but in residential real estate, selling and buying. And when I have a buyer that's going to offer on a house and the seller has done a pre inspection and they send it over. And by this point, I've been to enough inspections that I think you might even, call me your sidekick. I mean, I've been around enough that I know a lot about houses. And I can read this report and just think, oh my gosh, I could have written a better report. Like I could have
Yeah.
done a better job. And so, to brokers listening out there, be careful who you choose to do your pre-inspections. Make sure they're worth your time. Make sure they're comprehensive. Make sure they're giving the buyer any and all information about the house, because it's just a waste of time. And what it does is it puts the leverage back in the buyer's side to then negotiate, and you're sort of stuck now off market with the pending inspection status, waiting for the buyer to hopefully not, come up with something too expensive. So yeah, kind of go for the gold on that one and don't skimp is my
I
advice.
couldn't agree more. I've been in some of those awkward situations where it's like, hey, we've already had an inspection. Why are you here? And then you find a bunch of things that weren't found, and it gets very awkward quickly. So I think you're either all in on that from my perspective, like do it right, or just don't do it and let buyers get their own inspectors.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So tell us a little bit about this book. The book that you wrote is called The Confident House Hunter or Home Hunter. And when did you write that book?
Back in 2016, and
Okay.
the genesis was working for first-time homebuyers in particular. And at the end of the inspection, like, man, I learned all this stuff about houses, and I had like a month where four people said to me, "I wish I had known all this stuff before I started looking for a house." And then you sort of realize, like, geez, I missed that class in high school where we learned to look at buildings. And I missed that part of the broker exam where they taught me about buildings.
Yeah.
And, let's be honest, the training for a home inspector, we lose the forest for the trees. The training is very like electrical and roofing and plumbing and siding and all that's great, but it doesn't synthesize all that material into a way to kind of think about buildings and handle how are we going to digest the information that an inspector gathers. And if we don't have those tools, I think what happens in real estate is a lot of brokers look for home inspectors that don't find anything. And
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
think that's like a good solution to like not being able to digest a lot of information. So anyway, that was kind of why I wanted to do it. And then the interesting thing happened of like, well, what are you going to do? Like, how are you going to like teach people how to look at a building? I mean, that's a super fun like exercise that I put myself through. And so like one of the things that comes up, I love that, the saying is, does the house have good bones? But few people, I mean, nobody really knows what that means. Like nobody defines it, right? I mean, I think we have the sense of like it's the structure part. But I actually put some effort into thinking about it. And to me, there's a lot more of to the bones of a building than just the foundation and the frame. One of my favorites is access. And if you have really good access to things, everything becomes really fixable. And a building could last for hundreds of years. If you have really poor access to stuff when the house needs new wiring, where do you run it?
Yeah.
Now everything becomes way more complicated. So anyway, that's just one example of, I put a bunch of thought into the book of how you kind of think about these things and what are the bones of a building. And that way, when you get the inspection report, you have a sort of filter to push it through. Another good example, I'm sure that you have to do this all the time. And brokers, I mean, there's a lot of great language in this book of how to prep the client for getting the inspection report. So, I mean, how often have you had people freak out when a house needs a new roof covering? To me, a house that needs a new roof covering is like a car that needs new tires. I mean, it's an inevitable fact of life, and the sun will break down your roof and you're going to have to replace it. I call those disposable systems. And there's all these systems. It's like, look, every 20 years or so, you're going to have to redo these. And that's just a part of home ownership. And ideally, you budget for that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, making sure I get it right, the confident home hunter, is that right?
It's Confident House Hunter.
Okay, I can't even read my own writing, Dylan, so I apologize for that. I'm going to say it again so we get it right. The Confident House Hunter is the name of Dylan's book. For listeners, brokers out there that are listening, what a great gift to give the buyers after you have done your buyer consultation with them and you're starting to talk about the process of buying a home. And here's a reference and a great gift to say, here's a book that's an easy read and really preps you for this part of the process. So think about that and read it yourself, get Dylan's take on it. But I think any and all information we can hand to our buyers to prep them specifically for that important piece. I think there's a lot of buyers that get scared of inspections and get overwhelmed, and they're sort of looking to you, buyer broker, to say, what do we do with this? And here's one way to sort of head that off and say, read this book first. We're going to talk more about the process later, but let's start with this book. So thank you for writing it.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know a bunch of brokers will have a handful of copies and they've made custom bookmarks that are like,
Nice.
hey, go to these pages. Like if you don't have time to read a whole book, which it's America, nobody has time to read a book anymore, right? At least read these like 10 pages because these are the nuggets that are going to help you when we get the home inspection because it's
Nice.
going to happen. You're going to be reading these and you need to have filters to be able to digest that. So yeah, we all need to know kind of when to freak out and when not to. And it's so subjective, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I tell this story in my book, but I did a house for a builder once or an inspection. And at the end, we decided that it was better off to tear the house down than to fix it. And
Wow.
he was like, "Oh, good. I was hoping you were going to say that." It was so much work. He didn't really want to fix it, and he was a builder and he knew what he was doing, but he wanted like another opinion on like, should I try to fix this or should we tear it down? He'd bought the land, and I think it was a land play anyway. But what a good example of like if an inspection on a teardown can go well, then any inspection can go well. It's
So
really all
true.
about the expectations of people going into it.
Exactly.
Um,
There's you said something about access. So you were speaking about good bones. And then you were sort of like, we have sort of relegated that to like, yeah, the foundation's solid and the framing looks pretty good, right? And we've left it there. But when you brought up access, it made me think about that story about the guy who says, if you want to find a good framer, you're asking the person that's coming after them, right? If you want to find a good drywaller, you want to find a good framer, ask the drywaller because they're going to know if that person if those walls are level and who
totally.
does that well, right? So it's kind of fun to talk through what an inspection means to a buyer and getting their mind sort of enlarged around what a good home inspection looks like and what a good home looks like. And oftentimes in my home inspection, I like to ask the inspector, is this a home that you think overall is in good shape? And what does that mean? And the buyers want to hear that because sometimes an inspection feels like a fine tooth comb, which is your job. It's your job to sort of point out everything and anything that could be wrong with this house. But at the end of the day, the overall picture still is, yeah, I think it's a pretty decent house. Here's some things you're going to have to attend to.
I couldn't agree more, and it's why a good relationship between the inspector and the broker is so important because
Yeah.
there is these sort of lines where like I don't know what they can afford. I don't know whether they're at the top of their price or not. There's a lot of factors that really an inspector can't take into the equation of whether it's a good inspection or not because it's really all relative to who the buyer is. And I remember doing a really awesome sort of grandma mid-century house years ago. And I mean, I loved the house and I told them that, but it was grandma's house. And I think they had two babies and like two other kids. And, were like completely frazzled with just trying to live. And they were going to buy grandma's house, which was not, likely to respond well to like the daily rigors of family use without updating, and so they were sort of getting into a project. And then it was like, well, can you afford the project? And more importantly, even if you could, do you really have the time? Like,
Yeah,
right? I mean, there's all these like human elements of these decisions that
for sure.
have absolutely nothing to do with how well an inspection went. And I told them on this house, like, I'd love to buy this house. This is an awesome house, but it's at a place where, the change of occupant behavior is always, and that's a hard one to write up in the report, isn't it? You
Sure
know?
is. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because that is very specific to whoever's buying it. Pocket Hours is brought to you by Scout Real Estate. Hi, I'm Jennifer Nelson, owner at Scout Real Estate. I started this firm with the vision of doing things differently, with our focus on legendary service for our clients and creating a community of producing agents to spur each other to do higher quality work. If you are interested in learning more about how a small group of like-minded brokers have come together to have some fun while doing a lot of business, reach out to me, 206-227-7966, or email jennifer@scoutrealestate.com. I promise you this, fun is a high priority for me, but so is winning. So if you appreciate those two things, you might be interested in Scout. Looking forward to hearing from you. Let's switch gears for a minute. I have, in my years of doing this, witnessed inspectors come in and buyer brokers sit down on their phone and say, okay, take it away, inspector. I'm going to be over here playing Candy Crush because this isn't my thing. I kind of want to stay out of this part of it. And then back to the other side of the coin, which is where I live, which is I am lockstep with my buyer, asking questions that the buyers might not know to ask of the inspector. I want to know because I'm going to be representing them on whatever outcome that is. I'm sure you've seen all the spectrum of that show up. And do you have any comment on that?
Oh, yeah, that's an awesome question because I think there's a great opportunity for buyer brokers to really help the inspection go well. And the first step is before the inspection. Let's prep for with something like my book, where it's like, let's prep for how this is likely to go. Let's get people having read a couple inspections so they understand there's always stuff in them. I mean, a good home buyer should be able to distinguish a good inspection report from a bad one. And I don't mean like how it turned out. I mean the quality of
Right,
the work that was being done.
right.
One of my favorite brokers I used to work with, I remember this was years ago. I was pretty new and I showed up and there was an envelope engineer, a structural engineer, a soils guy, and
Wow.
me and a I mean, this is a fancy house but it was stucco with no roof overhangs and it was on a hillside and so he was on it. I mean, all of these specialists were out as this like massive due diligence run, and it was like, wow, this is like due diligence. We're digging into this, and
Yeah.
and it was cool. Everyone was like talking to each other and sharing information. We're going to get to the bottom of this house. So that's taking it to an extreme, but just like you said, being involved in the inspection. And a lot of the parts of the country, the brokers don't have to be there for the inspection. So the inspectors just let themselves in, do their thing, and leave. And I think that's an awful disservice to the buyer. I think we're really lucky, honestly, where I know it's a lot of extra work for brokers, but at least where we work, our part of the MLS, the broker has to be there. And it's a great opportunity to kind of build relationships and discuss the finer points of these things. I think you really can't underestimate how not black and white buildings are.
Yeah,
I,
good
I
point.
mean, we have a building code, but the building codes change every 3 years, and we're constantly installing new systems, and those have different installation requirements. And it's really normal for different contractors to have different opinions on things. Really like taking that into account and being, building that into your process so that you understand that this whole messy thing that can get messy sometimes. And it's really hard as an inspector. I remember, especially early on, I'd work with a brand new broker, and as soon as I would find this something, aluminum solid conductor wiring, I would have this pit because I knew that it was a complicated subject. And when you first meet a new agent, not all of them seem to be very keen on wanting to embrace a complicated finding.
It's
They
true.
don't want it to be there.
Mm.
And I don't want it to be there, but it's there, you know, like I'm not going to like pretend it isn't. And so I think, you know, being willing and able to kind of dive into the gray areas is really important, you know.
It's true. I think about times when, and this is years of experience for me, but I know just enough to be dangerous, probably. But here's how it turns out good for me. Oftentimes, if it's a first time buyer, and I'm just going to stereotype for a minute. So this is a stereotype. There we go. And it's a female buyer, and her dad happens to be along for the inspection, which happens a lot. There's a little bit of a test that's happening here to see who I am as a broker and what I'm about. And so, to your point about saying, this is your time to shine and this is your time to gain points, however you want to say it, with your clients and their fathers or whomever that's along that knows a lot or thinks they know a lot, and your ability to sort of work with the inspector and ask good questions and follow up on things is showing your interest to have them do their due diligence to be able to know whether this is the house for them, not to rush through this inspection to go ahead and get to pending so you can get a paycheck. And
Yep.
the difference is how you show up during those hours of the inspection. So
Love that. Yeah.
yeah,
Couldn't
yeah,
agree
yeah.
more. And one of my favorite brokers I work with always says, "Well, I like having you do the inspection because I know when I go to sell the house in 5 years, a bunch of weird stuff's not going to come up and make me look bad."
There you go. I love that too.
Uh,
That's a good point.
It's a
Yeah,
cool business model, right? And that's,
yeah.
as an inspector, I've always had this business model of wanting, you know, a lot of inspectors worry about getting sued, but I don't want anybody to even complain or like have any, you know,
You're like
uh,
way before that. Yeah.
yeah, I mean that's like that's easy. Like I mean, you know, getting sued, you got to mess up pretty big. But I just don't. I want to be like as close to perfect as I can, and you know that's just a certain mindset, right? And but that is hard. I think that's what created the software in the book is just you know I want to deliver really good information, but if you deliver it to people that have absolutely no tools for digesting information, your hands are tied a little bit as an inspector, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
because you do need it's a baton, right? And we're sort of handing it off to the broker, and then they can run with it, you know. And I think really great buyer brokers just can handle all the weird things that come up,
Yep. For
you know.
sure. For sure. And just as this a word of caution too is buyer brokers, beware that if you are in an inspection with Dylan and Dylan's doing his comprehensive job and points out that additional inspections are required because it's out of his scope, but that he notices something, your job is to absolutely recommend and even, if I would so suggest, push your buyer into following through on all of those things. Because when it comes to lawsuits later, the person that should know more, which is you too, buyer broker, right? Is the person that should be able to show that they really recommended buyer, that you follow through on any and all of these things so that you have a very comprehensive idea of what you're walking into and buying. I just see a lot of these like, I would recommend go do this later, and nobody does it. They just are like, well, it's okay. It's on the inspection, but I'm sure it's fine. And that's a recipe for a lawsuit against you as a broker too. So yeah,
The market got so hot that people just were
yeah,
ignoring it all. I mean,
totally.
and you know, a scary thing for me was happening last spring when the market was just insane. And, you know, you hear people paying 500,000 over asking. And, you know, I start thinking like, well, what am I going to find that matters at that point? Like,
Good
I mean,
point.
you know, it's like what my job is now irrelevant.
Yeah,
If you're
so
that
right.
risk intolerant, you know,
Yeah,
and I think of times 10 years ago where people would like a deal would fall apart over like a dishwasher or
yeah,
something,
that's
you
right.
know, and now 10 years later, people are paying 500,000 over asking for a house. I mean, you know, it's just,
Yep.
it's all it's so it's very market driven, but I couldn't agree with you
Mm,
more. It's why I love the pre-listings if they're done well, is that
hmm.
all the information's on the table and you don't have that time constraint. When you're working for the buyer, there's often like 2 days, and that's just,
Hmm.
you know, you got go get a structural engineer in 2 days. I mean, go
Right,
get an
right.
electrician. I can't get an electrician to show up in my house in a month.
It's true.
You
It's very
know,
true. Yeah,
uh,
it's very true.
so that the time constraints for due diligence pose real problems, and
Yeah.
it's a great reason that those pre-listings have such an ability to like let's just get everything on the table and be like here it is, you know.
Hmm. For
Um,
sure. And to your point, I think people that don't do the pre-listings and then get caught up in the inspection cycle. We always talk about going off market for the inspection, but if you read that whole inspection contingency, this could keep you off market for weeks,
Yeah.
with the additional inspections and the time and people that sort of try to rush that. You have 2 days, like you said, are really setting themselves up later for a potential lawsuit by really trying to rush that time for the buyer to do their due diligence. And we are a buyer beware state, but I have seen cases that we've learned about over the years where it ends up that the judge says, "Hey, seller, what's the rush? It
Yeah.
looked like you had something to cover up, so let them do their work." And the best way to avoid all that is to just go ahead and get an inspection before you list. So,
Yeah.
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 Well, good. What else? If there's a couple other things that you want to say about your book, what would you be talking to us about?
I have a bunch of clock hour classes that are built around the book. I've got four different 4 hour clock hour classes. So one of them is just looking at the history of buildings. And that's actually incredibly useful to walk through 150 years of construction and just see how our buildings have changed. Because again, like the whole point is you need perspective. Right? So, I mean, well, was that a good inspection for this age and type of house? Right? I mean, because there's, and there's all these trends that I hit a point after all these years of doing it that you could give me an address and I could look it up, and I'm instantly populating lists of how my expectations are being populated just when I see the house because I know how old it is, where it is, and I have one picture of it. And that's such a huge advantage because I now have this like base to compare things to. And if you don't have that, all the data that comes in is just kind of random.
Yeah.
I once had a broker say to me, "Oh, you hated this house." And I was like, what a strange thing to say. I mean, for starters, it's an inanimate object,
Yeah.
and, for me, it's like, well, I don't know, there's just a lot of stuff to fix. Like, fix it, or redo it. But I mean, it's all fixable. But and that to that end, one of the mottos I came to in my book is every house is a great house for the right person at the right price.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Right? I
Yeah, for
mean,
sure.
certain houses lend themselves to like maybe a builder should buy it,
Right, for
and
sure. Yeah.
and it should be priced at a place where somebody could buy it and fix it. And I bought my house for what I thought the land was worth because I had to fix everything.
Yeah.
And so sure, free house, but then you fix it and you spend all this money fixing it, and it all sort of worked out right. So in any event, I think the classes and the book are really helpful ways to try to get out in front of the home inspection and make the inspection go well. Because I really firmly believe that this whole sort of old idea that the home inspector is the deal killer or whatever, I just don't think it needs to be there if we can kind of get expectations right.
Yep.
And that isn't to say, I mean, the home inspection industry has its share of education problems. I mean, and I was past president of ASHI Washington, and there's actually a new group in the Washington state now, the Northwest Home and Building Inspectors Association. And, we try to get together as inspectors and create organizations where we do continuing education and learn from each other and try to raise the bar. Because I know it's frustrating for brokers. I'm sure you've seen the quality of inspections be literally just all over the map, and that makes it really hard for buyers. And people price shop, and it's like, oh well, I mean, there's probably someone that'll do it for $200 if you keep calling enough people, but
Hmm.
it's not even the same service.
Yeah, for sure.
So I wish we had better definitions of home inspection because right? I mean, there's verbal consultations, and
Yeah.
I think a lot of the multi-inspection firms do a pretty good job at being like the sort of McDonald's, like it's consistent,
Yep.
and then there's sort of a lot of one-person shops, and some of them do amazing work, and some of them don't. And I don't know, it makes it really complicated, I think, for home buyers because it's not they're consumers that aren't purchasing this every day, right? So
Yep.
and so they rely on agents to help them find good inspectors. The
Yep.
buyer broker really such an important thing, and I'm sure all buyer brokers have a good list at their disposal when they need it. But I do think it's important to keep culling and looking for good inspectors.
I do too. And we can joke that say not all inspectors are created equally, and I would say similarly, not all realtors are created equally. And so as much as you, buyer broker, believe that you're offering a different level of service to your buyer, you're going to want to find partners that match that same level. You don't want to sort of dip down and have somebody that's cheaper, quote unquote, come do your home inspection to save your client money. You're going to want to say it's about the value. So the cost becomes somewhat irrelevant to what you're actually getting value wise. So I want to switch gears just at the end here to talk a little bit about in our forms. Now, it says if you do a home inspection and you send that inspection as a buyer broker over to the listing agent without their permission or request for it, you are waiving the inspection. Essentially. And so that's a pretty critical thing for your buyers. So just as a reminder and a warning to anybody listening, this information is for you and for your buyer from the inspector. And be careful wherever you send it, because it really becomes information that is critical to the success of that transaction. And if you're trying to prove a point on an inspection or negotiate, make sure that you have written permission to send those pages or the whole report over to that broker. Otherwise, you are effectively waiving the inspection for your buyer. So it's just a weird time, and sellers are saying, gosh, we didn't want to know any of that. That's now a material fact that we have to disclose to the next buyer. So this inspection really is for your buyer to do their comprehensive work and know what they're getting into. So
Yeah.
yeah,
It's also
yeah,
probably, I imagine it puts some risk and challenge on the buyer broker where you have to rephrase things. I mean, you can't like copy and paste a part of the report. You've got to like
right.
rephrase it. So
Yep,
understanding terminology and knowing how to rephrase that becomes, literally sort of legally important.
yep, for
So
sure, for sure.
it's an additional challenge.
Yeah, and this is where I think, and I might get myself in trouble on my own podcast by saying this, but this is where phone calls go a really long way in our business to create good relationships with other brokers. To just call them and be able to say, "Hey, we're up against this issue in the house, and we're trying to figure out how to word this on the report," instead of sort of sending back reports that then become material facts to the house. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's good advice, I bet. Not my world, but I can see how valuable that would be. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, Dylan, I so appreciate your time. And I just want to kind of recap to say that I'd love for you to check out The Confident House Hunter as a book and really consider that for giving that away to your buyers. It's a great gift. But then, Dylan, what's the name of your inspection company as well?
Orca Inspection Services. So,
Orca Inspection
and yeah,
Services.
I work in King and Kitsap County,
Okay.
and yeah, I've been doing it for about 20 years. So,
All
yeah,
right.
happy to
Awesome.
go out and do inspections.
Good. And then your classes that you offer, where are those advertised, or where could brokers find out about those?
Yeah, so I do them. If you want to have them in your office, you can just reach out to me and I
Okay.
go into the office. I try to have at least, 10 people there to sort of
Yep.
make it worth it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I haven't gotten them going yet this year, but I do them via Zoom. I don't like them via Zoom as much. I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
teach clock hour classes and doing it via Zoom is sometimes you
Harder.
feel like you're talking to a wall.
Oh, for
It's
sure. For sure.
I try to make my classes really fun and interesting, and I've got, 20 years worth of cool slides of field slides and stuff. So
Yeah.
I really enjoy them. They're sort of a labor of love. But if you want to have fun and interesting, cool CE classes, then reach out to me. And when I do them via Zoom, I, just shoot them out into the webosphere, right? So whatever. I've got mailing lists and put them on Facebook and all that kind of stuff, so you can keep
Okay.
an eye out for them. Yeah.
Yeah. So, broker, if you're listening to this and want to have Dylan come to your office, just check in with your designated broker and connect him with Dylan, and I'm sure he can set up a class to come to your space. So, thank you so much, Dylan. I appreciate your time and
Oh,
expertise. I really happy to have you on the show.
yeah. Fun chatting with you, Jennifer. Thanks for having me on.
You bet. Thank you so much for listening in to Pocket Hours. I hope this has been interesting, fun, made you laugh, made you think, spurred you on to do and implement some new things in your business. I appreciate your time and hope this has been a good use of it, period. Now, go be the agent you would hire.